Hi, I'm Truman. I'd like to understand how things work, and today I'm going to talk about how does Apple makes its money exactly. First, I'd like to understand how big Apple is. Everyone knows Apple is a very large company, but sometimes it's just important to know how big Apple is number-wise and compare that to some different other metrics. There are two ways to understand how big Apple is. The first is by its revenue. As you can see here, Apple's revenue is $366 billion, which is a lot of money. Its market cap is 2.5 trillion. Now, to put that into perspective, US GDP as of 2020 is 23 trillion, and that means Apple is 11% of the size of the US economy on its own. And if you consider Apple as a country, and where does that sit? Apple is going to be the 8th largest country in the world, right between France and Italy. France GDP is $2.9 trillion. Italy's GDP is 2.1. So that helps you understand Apple, if it's a country on its own, it's going to be the 8th largest country, which is very rare for a single company. And next is really the common sense question you want to ask, which is how does Apple make its revenue? There are three ways to break it down. The first one is by product and services. Apple makes 81% of its revenue from the products and 19% from the services. The second is a level down from products into different product categories. iPhone is 53%, Mac is about 10%, iPad 9%, wearables, homes and accessories at 11%, and services 19%. So as you can see clearly, iPhone is doing a lot of heavy lifting, and it's more than half of Apple's revenue. And within services, if you're wondering what are they, a lot of these products you may use them yourself. iCloud, I myself pay for iCloud for storage. Apple Pay, whenever I use Apple Pay, the merchants will pay a commission fee to Apple. That's how Apple makes its money. Rather than from me myself as a consumer, it takes money from the merchants. iMusic, Apple Care Plus, App Store is another big source of revenue within the services. Basically, that's where Apple charges money from the developers. If you have an in-app purchase like we do at Gen Impact, whenever there is a subscriber, Apple takes a cut of that revenue from us. So that is how Apple makes money. If you look at 5 years ago, services is a very, very small percentage of Apple's revenue, but today it's sitting at 19%, which is a pretty large contribution comparing to where it was 5, or even 10 years ago. And the third way to look at the revenue breakdown is by region. So America's 42%, Europe 25%, China 19%, Japan about 8%, and rest of Asia Pacific 7%. The main takeaway is, Apple considers China and Japan as, two individual regions, just sitting side by side with Europe and Americas. And it's just pretty amazing to see China is 19% of its total revenue base. Traditionally, if you ask me where does Apple makes most of its money, I say Americas and Europe. But right now, China is a pretty large contributor to Apple's top line. And this is where things are becoming more interesting. Rather than just look at the pie chart of different revenue sources, we now compare of each segment or each region how fast the revenue is growing. As you can see here, the revenue growth by segment, iPhone is by far the largest growth area. It grew about 39% for the 12 months from 2020 to 2021. That is a very, very high growth number considering how big Apple is already. Mac, 21%, slower growth than the rest of the group. iPad, 33%, that's pretty fast. Wearables, 23%, that is the area that I say I was expecting higher growth, just because people are using a lot of the Apple Watches or AirPods, but it's only growing at 23%. It's a bit of disappointing there. And services, 26%. And here you can see the revenue growth by different regions. China itself is by far the single largest growth contribution to Apple. America is 22%, that is the lowest, not surprisingly because the penetration there is already very high. Europe 29%, Japan 33%, rest of the Asia Pacific 30%. And after revenue, the next common sense question you want to ask is how profitable Apple is. There are three ways to look at how profitable a business is. Gross margin, operating margin, and net profit margin. So gross margin by definition is the amount of revenue you make minus the cost of producing that revenue, such as into manufacturing, into productions. And you can see here Apple's total gross margin is 42%. Or within that, product is 35% and services is 69%. Services is, even though it's only 19% of Apple's revenue, but when it comes to profitability, it is a much higher profit area. So producing almost 70% gross profit margin, whereas the product side of it is only doing 35%. And after gross margin, you now have operating margin and net profit margin. As for Apple, the net profit margin is 26% and operating margin is 30%. So what is the difference? So from 42% gross profit margin to 30% operating margin, you have staff, you have R&D, marketing, sales. So all of these daily operating expenses are going to eat your operating margin. And then from operating margin to net profit margin, the difference is going to be interest payments, taxes, and some other small expenses. And that is taking 4% away. Now you may ask, what is the biggest risk Apple faces? Personally, I think it's the understanding of research and development of Apple. Now why that is important is, for a technology company like Apple, it needs to constantly invent new things and invest profits in the new growth areas or upgrading the existing product packs. And ideally, the company needs to grow its R&D spending in line with its revenue. Now, Apple has 33% revenue growth, but compared to that, its R&D growth is only 16%. What this tells you is Apple is actually underspending in research and development. Now, as a company that relies people to buy new products every year or every few years, Apple needs to constantly produce new products so that people will get rid of their old phones and buy new phones. And what Apple relies on is that constant upgrade, and the difference has to be meaningful enough for people to ditch their old phones and buy a new one. And a big part of that comes from the research and development. So if for all the profits Apple generates, it's not spending as much as it should in R&D, it will have negative impact down the road in 2-3 years time. And while we talk about the biggest risk, we also need to talk about what are the biggest opportunities. And that is China and services. Because China is the fastest growing country at Apple, and services has the highest margin. And there's also this big industry tailwind that has been taking place in the last 20-30 years. And that is, people are just using consumer electronics to do more and more their daily activities. And rather than doing different activities with different devices, it's all converging into either a phone or a laptop. And that increase of timeshare just simply means people will always be in demand for these products. So on an industry level, that is a tailwind for every company that is involved in this kind of businesses, such as Apple, Samsung, Xiaomi, and Huawei. So as long as Apple keeps innovating and bringing new products that people love to buy, use, and pay for, Apple is going to be a good investment to hold on to. And finally, let's take a look at Apple's checklist. By checklist, it's really a very simple to use toolbox that helps you understand a company in a very quick, shorter period of time. And in this case, there are many things that you need to consider on Apple: its quality, its value, its ESG, dividends, growth, etc., etc. And rather than you doing all the numbers and crunching and maintaining your spreadsheets, we do the heavy lifting for you here. So of all these areas that you should pay attention to, Apple is actually doing a very decent job in most of the categories except its valuation. So it's really coming down to what type of investor you are. If you are a value investor and you would never pay for something that is seemingly expensive, you might want to avoid Apple. But at the same time, you have to consider Apple's valuation. Is it justifiably expensive? Because value is only one part of the equation. At the same time, you should look at quality, dividends, growth, etc. So that is the quick fact check on Apple and some of the key important areas, number-wise facts that I think we should pay attention to. Let me know if you find it useful or not, and any companies you want me to go through, tell me in the comments.